Okay, so in this short talk here, we're going to talk about human-computer interaction and potential futures in HCI. So this is pretty speculative. It's based on some of interest that I have, and so this is a particular look at where human-computer interaction could be heading. So a couple of things to consider, obviously, is that the graphical user interface, as we know, was really born in Xerox PARC and as part of Star OS, and that has seen the vast majority of our screen-based interfaces have this GUI interface, which allows us to drag and drop objects. It has menus, and we see that across predominantly every screen-based device that we have. Of course, there has been the introduction of touch input. So in 2007, the iPhone was introduced, which had very responsive touch input and also enabled multi-touch. So that was enabling you to use more than one finger. And of course, the main thing here though was that it just simplified the graphical user interface into icons, removed some of the file system, so in those menus and things had gone, and put things inside apps. But generally, the interface was very similar. You would navigate through screens to accomplish various tasks. Of course, a few things have been added as we've worked through, particularly with the mobile devices. Obviously, haptic inputs have played quite a substantial role. So that's feedback from when you push or provide physical feedback from the device. So in the case of the iPhone and the Apple trackpads, if you press firmly on the device, you'll undertake like 3D touch. And that provides some feedback in the sense of vibration. So this is known as haptic feedback. So when you're interfacing with a device, if you're getting feedback that is causing like you to sense something, a movement, this is known as haptic feedback, and that's another way that computers can interact with us. There's been a few other movements, such as things like the leap motion, which allows for motion-based input into different devices. So you can plug this into your Mac or PC and allow motion-based inputs. And of course, we've seen this utilized in the games arena, such as with the original Wii, and then onto the Xbox with the Kinect and the PlayStation Eye and the various cameras used to detect motion as game inputs. And we've seen very little use of this actually in terms of graphical user interfaces. Of course, films like Minority Report, we think of areas where we've got not only touch feedback but also motion, allowing us to manipulate objects, and of course haptic feedback as well, so that physical feedback. But again, still quite screen-based in this sense. There's been a maneuver in a few other areas which was semi-interesting. So we've got things like the Muse device, which is a device that has a numerous numbers of sensors, allowing you to control devices through your thoughts. So this is a relatively new area, and an area where we can start to manipulate computers that maybe are screen-based or not, but through the things that we through our own thoughts and actions. So combining, obviously, again, a different type of input and a different type of interaction. There are other devices where we can use just our eyes to maneuver objects and devices around on screen. And of course, we've seen a more recent rise in virtual reality or VR. So of course, that isn't a recent thing. In fact, VR has been around for a long, long time, and there's a very long history going back into the Victorian ages of what would be considered virtual reality. But recently, there's been a big rise in it, particularly with the power in gaming, and we're seeing a couple of devices like the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive, which combines obviously a screen that's very close to you, so you are immersed in an environment. It has headphones to immerse you in sound, and the HTC Vive has these controllers that you can hold in your hand, which also allow you to interact with objects through your body movement. So not only can you look around, but also it can figure out where you are in space using a number of cameras. So this is a combination of that camera technology along with an immersive screen and headphone experience, and obviously augmented physical items that produce digital artifacts in the virtual world. So this immerses you completely in a new virtual world. Still relatively expensive. A HTC Vive will be about £600 or £700. You need quite a substantial room to set up the cameras to get that full experience. There's also been the move, obviously, in augmented reality. So here we've got a very well-known augmented reality game, Pokemon Go. But of course, augmented reality is about being able to use your camera that exists on your device to enable you to add or augment to the world around you. So you can add in new features, new things that maybe help you to navigate that space. So that might be utilizing, instead of just looking at a map, that it would actually allow you to have directions appearing straight in front of you on the screen. In connection with augmented reality, there's been quite a big movement in what Microsoft are terming mixed reality. So we saw obviously initially with the Google Glass device, which was a small headset device that you could wear, which put a small screen effectively in front of your vision to allow you to add or mix to reality, so you could see a combination of things. The HoloLens from Microsoft has been looking at this mixed reality environment where you can then work through seeing digital artifacts in a physical space and work with others to manipulate those objects. But of course, those objects are not actually there. They are being created by the computer. And in fact, with the HoloLens, you're pretty much wearing a PC on your head. It's quite a strange experience, but this enables you to interact. And of course, if you have multiple users, they can all see the same thing from multiple angles. The promotional work like this gives a very misleading way of how the HoloLens actually functions, and the vision of it is pretty limited. In fact, they try and show it that it's more like a very immersive VR style, but in fact you get very small vision, so it's got quite a long way to go. Of course, there is a few artists who've been looking at these things and thinking about them. So there's this is from a YouTube clip called Hyper Reality, which imagines that our worlds will be constantly augmented in this way. So by wearing, whether it be a Google Glass type device, which in fact has seen a resurgence in the last year in use for sort of packing and various other activities, where it's actually become a very useful tool, but it didn't really turn into the mainstream tool that they suspected. So whether this will turn into reality, who knows? Whether we want to see this kind of level of augmentation of our entire environment, but only time will tell in that regard. Something else to bear in mind, though, that obviously a lot of this relates to where human-computer interaction goes in terms to adding or escaping from our current environment. And some of the additions in regards to the graphical user interface, of course, have been around sort of touch input and feedback, so that we can kind of understand a little bit more about what we're doing. But there hasn't been much change in that sense in terms of how we interact with these objects. They're still sitting in little boxes, etc. So one of the things that's super interesting, if we look back at some of the history around human-computer interaction, and we look at, Lick Leider, Alan Kay, Doug Engelbart, Ted Nelson, they were looking at tools for thinking. They were, interested in, Lick Leider looked at man-computer symbiosis, so how men and computers would work together. Engelbart was looking at the framework for augmenting human intellect, and so there was Doug was looking at also dynamic knowledge repositories, etc. But obviously there's been this dominance of GUI-based and screen-based interfaces that have mainly taken the hold of most mainstream human-computer interaction. Now there's an area where this is being pushed forward, and something that I think is interesting to look at, and I think something to investigate further. So there is a guy called Brett Victor, who's been looking for a long time at sort of direct manipulation, in particular starting with sort of coding, so how we could move from a text-based code editor to a direct manipulation based code editor, and that by doing so he imagines a time when we can design at the speed of thought. So I think this is really kind of pushing on from the ideas that came out of the augmenting thinking from Engelbert, Linklater, Kay, and even Nelson. And he is working currently in a Y Combinator research lab called the Human Advancement Research Community. And what's super interesting about all of this is that he is taking forward the idea of small talk, originally something Alan Kay worked on in regards to the Diner book. He's working on an environment called Real Talk in a space called Dynamic Land, and this exists and it's definitely worth having a look at. And it's a really interesting thing because unlike most computer systems where you engage obviously with virtual objects that are rendered on the screen in general or on headsets, Real Talk uses objects that are ordinary physical objects, so paper, pebbles, whatever, and they are brought to life through technology that's built into the ceiling, so lots of cameras and things. But in this instance, it enables you to, and here you've got an illustration of some of the things that have been happening in this lab, where you can actually draw on pieces of paper and they become dynamic objects that are either projected onto in the space or enable you to manipulate other parts on other devices. So it's really, really interesting, and there's a whole bunch of talks that Brett has given that sort of lead up to this, and I think that's something to look at. So he's talked about inventing on principle, these are all on Vimeo, the future of programming, and related directly to Dynamic Land was a presentation he gave called the Human Representation of Thought. So really trying to push the idea that actually there may be another way of us interacting with computers, and that may not in fact involve a screen, it may not involve a device, it will use everyday objects to bring additional life so that we can design at the speed of thought. And I think that's something super interesting about where HCI might be going. So there's a long history in terms of the graphical user interface, less in terms of additional types of interface. And I think with the power that computing has, there's the ability for really human-computer interaction to go somewhere else. A really interesting way of thinking about this, and I think something that's worth investigating, and I'm going to give you a couple of things to consider. Dunn and Raby came up with the speculative design process, and so this book, Speculative Everything, it gives you a way to think through speculative design and how you might imagine different futures, etc., through a whole bunch of sort of specific design thinking type of methodology. And I think that's what people like Doug Engelbert, Alan Kay, Brett Victor now, they really have thought through and speculated where could we take the thinking tools of the future. And so human-computer interaction, of course, will become more and more important as we allow computers to do the things that they're good at and allow humans to do the things that they're fantastic at, and how those two could really form a proper human-computer symbiosis. So that was a rapid introduction to possible futures of human-computer interaction from the point of view that I'm interested in, and I think will be of interest in general, to look at how that is affecting our current world. So there's a couple of things to take a look at. So I suggest that you watch the documentary Lo and Behold, Revelries of the Connected World. So this is a great Werner Herzog documentary about the internet and some of the issues that we may face around that. Fantastic look at some of the current thinkers, such as Elon Musk and others. And of course, Charlie Brooker's Black Mirror is a fantastic series of effectively design speculation and speculative design processes. So do please check those out.